The jungle breathes at night. On the island of Guadalcanal in August 1942, the darkness is not empty. It is heavy and thick, and it smells of rotting vegetation and salt water and fear. For the young American Marines dug into the sand along the banks of the Tenaru River, silence is the enemy. Silence means the enemy is moving. Silence means the Japanese are crawling through the tall kunai grass inch by inch, pulling their bodies through the mud with knives in their teeth and grenades clutched in their hands. It is 2 o'clock in the morning on August 21st. The air is hot and humid, sticking to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Inside a shallow foxhole, a 19-year-old Marine named Thomas wipes sweat from his eyes and grips the cold steel trigger of a 37mm anti-tank gun. He is tired. He has not slept properly in 3 days. His uniform is rotting off his body from the dampness, and his stomach is empty because supplies are running low. But tonight, hunger is the last thing on his mind. Tonight, he is listening. Somewhere out there in the crushing blackness beyond the barbed wire, 900 soldiers of the elite Ichiki Detachment are waiting. These are not raw recruits. They are veterans of the China campaign. They are hardened warriors who believe they are invincible. They believe that the Americans are soft and weak and will run at the first sign of a bayonet. They are waiting for the signal to launch a Banzai charge that is designed to overwhelm the American line through sheer, terrifying mass. Thomas looks at his loader. In a normal war, against a normal enemy, they would be loading high-explosive shells to destroy bunkers, or armor-piercing shells to punch through tanks. But this is not a normal war. This is the Pacific, and the enemy is not a tank. The enemy is a human wave. So they do not load an explosive shell. Instead, they slide a strange-looking round into the breech. It looks like a simple tin can, crimped at the top and painted olive-drab. It looks harmless. It looks like a soup can. But inside that thin metal skin sits a darker kind of engineering. Suddenly, a green flare pops in the sky above them, bathing the riverbank in a sickly, artificial light. The silence breaks. It doesn't break with a whisper, but with a scream. A single voice cries out from the jungle, followed by hundreds more. Banzai! The sound is terrifying. It is a primal release of fury designed to freeze the blood of anyone who hears it. Then comes the sound of boots, hundreds of hobnailed boots pounding against the hard sand of the river bar. The Japanese army is charging. They are running straight into the teeth of the American defense, believing that their spirit is stronger than American steel. Thomas pulls the firing lever. The 37mm gun bucks violently against its recoil springs. A tongue of flame shoots out of the barrel, lighting up the foxhole for a fraction of a second. What happens next isn't just a kill. It is an erasure. The tin can disintegrates the moment it leaves the muzzle. 122 steel balls fan out into the night air, traveling at twice the speed of sound. The front rank of the Japanese charge doesn't fall. It simply vanishes. Men are turned into mist. The charge doesn't break, it evaporates. This is the story of the M2 Canister Shot, the weapon that turned a tank gun into the world's largest shotgun and changed the psychology of the Pacific War forever. To understand the sheer brutality of that moment, we must first understand the machine that delivered it. The weapon was the M3 Stuart light tank and its towed anti-tank variant. In the open deserts of North Africa or the hedgerows of Europe, the M3 Stuart was considered obsolete almost as soon as it arrived. It was too lightly armored. Its 37mm gun was too small to penetrate the thick steel of German panzers. British crews nicknamed it the Honey because it was fast and reliable, but against a Tiger tank, it was nothing more than a nuisance. American soldiers called its gun the Door Knocker, because shells would simply bounce off the German armor like pebbles. But war is about context. A weapon that is useless in one theater can be a god of destruction in another. In the dense jungles of the Pacific,
the M3 Stuart found its true calling. Here, there were no Tiger tanks. The Japanese armor was thin and scarce. The real enemy in the Pacific was the infantry. The Japanese tactical doctrine relied heavily on the concept of spiritual superiority. They believed that a soldier willing to die could overcome any mechanical disadvantage. They specialized in night attacks and close-quarters combat, and the terrifying Banzai charge, where hundreds of men would rush a position simultaneously, willing to take 90% casualties just to get one man into the trench with a bayonet. Against this tactic, a standard cannon shell is inefficient. If you fire a solid armor-piercing bolt at a charging crowd, you might hit one man. The shell will pass right through him and bury itself in a tree trunk a mile away. It is a waste of energy. Even a high-explosive shell has limitations in the thick mud and sand of the jungle, which can absorb the blast and fragmentation. The Americans needed something else. They needed a weapon that didn't just kill a specific target, but created a zone of death. They needed to turn the air itself into a weapon. Enter the M2 Canister round. The engineering behind this shell was deceptively simple, but horrifyingly effective. It was not a new idea. Artillery crews in the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War had used canister shot to break cavalry charges. But in 1942, the technology had been refined with industrial precision. The projectile itself was a flat-nose cylinder made of very thin sheet steel. Inside this casing, engineers packed 122 hardened steel balls. These were not random scraps of metal. They were perfectly spherical ball bearings, each measuring 0.375 inches in diameter. That is roughly the size of a large marble or a .36 caliber bullet. To keep them from rattling around inside the casing, they were embedded in a matrix of brittle resin. This resin served a critical purpose. It held the balls in a solid mass during handling and loading, but it was designed to shatter instantly under the shock of firing. When the gunner pulled the trigger, the propellant charge behind the shell exploded, creating thousands of pounds of pressure. The shell was forced down the rifled barrel of the gun. The rifling, the spiral grooves cut into the barrel, usually spins a shell to make it accurate over long distances. But for the canister round, this spin created a different effect: centrifugal force. As the shell accelerated, the rotation pushed the steel balls outward against the thin tin casing.
The moment the shell cleared the muzzle of the gun, the air resistance and the centrifugal force ripped the thin casing apart. There was no fuse. There was no explosion at the target. The casing simply peeled away like the skin of a banana, and the 122 steel balls were released into free flight. Because they were already spinning, they didn't fly in a straight line. They spread out, forming a widening cone of destruction. Let us look at the physics of this for a moment. A standard 12-gauge shotgun, loaded with double-aught buckshot, fires about 9 pellets. If you have ever seen what a shotgun does to a target at close range, you know it is devastating. Now imagine the M3 anti-tank gun. It fired the equivalent of 13.5 shotgun shells all at once. And it didn't just fire them. It launched them at a velocity of 2,600 feet per second. For comparison, the speed of sound is roughly 1,100 feet per second. These steel balls were moving so fast that the shockwave alone could rupture organs. At a range of 30 yards, the pattern of the balls would spread to cover a circle about 10 feet wide. This was the kill zone. Anything inside that 10-foot circle wasn't just hit, it was shredded. The kinetic energy of a single one of those steel balls was enough to tear through a human body, penetrate the man behind him, and still have enough energy to shatter a tree branch. Now multiply that by 122. When fired into a mass of charging infantry, the effect was gruesome. The balls didn't just wound, they dismembered. They cut through bone and muscle and equipment as if it were paper. And the M3 gun could be reloaded and fired every 3 to 4 seconds by a skilled crew. That meant a single gun could put thousands of steel projectiles into the air in less than a minute, creating a wall of lead that was mathematically impossible to survive. But technology means nothing without the men who use it. To understand the horror of that night on Guadalcanal, we have to look at the men holding the line. The 1st Marine Division had landed on the island on August 7, 1942.
It was the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific. They had seized the unfinished Japanese airfield and renamed it Henderson Field. But seizing it was the easy part. Holding it would be a nightmare. The Japanese high command was humiliated. They viewed the Americans as soft and undisciplined. They decided to send in a force to wipe them out. They chose the Ichiki Detachment, named after its commander, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. Ichiki was a man of the old samurai tradition. He was aggressive and arrogant. He had landed on the island with only the first echelon of his troops, about 900 men. He was advised to wait for the rest of his force to arrive before attacking. But Ichiki refused. He believed that 900 Japanese soldiers were more than a match for 10,000 Americans. He wrote in his diary that he would recapture the airfield in a single night. He marched his men through the jungle, hacking their way through vines and wading through swamps. They reached the east bank of the Tenaru River, officially known as the Ilu River, on the night of August 20th, 1942. Across the river lay the Marine perimeter. The Marines had dug in along the west bank using the river as a natural moat. They had strung barbed wire and set up machine gun nests. And critically, they had positioned their 37mm anti-tank guns to fire directly across the sandbar that separated the river from the ocean.
The sandbar was the only dry path across the river. It was a narrow strip of sand, maybe 30 yards wide. Ichiki saw it as a bridge. The Marines saw it as a funnel, a choke point, a kill zone. The Marine commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, sensed that an attack was coming. The jungle had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural. He ordered his men to stay alert. If they come, he told them, they will come across that sandbar. The attack began at 2 a.m. The first sign was the green flare, signaling the charge. Then the screaming started. The Japanese soldiers surged out of the coconut grove on the east bank. They didn't use cover. They didn't crawl. They ran. They ran straight onto the sandbar, shouting Banzai, their bayonets gleaming in the starlight. They were sprinting directly into the sights of the 37mm guns. On the west bank, the Marine gunners watched the dark shapes materialize out of the gloom. They waited. They had been trained to wait. You do not fire until you can see the whites of their eyes, or in this case, until you can see the outline of their helmets against the surf. When the Japanese wave was halfway across the sandbar, the Marines opened fire. The sound of the canister shot was different from a normal explosion. It was a sharp crack, followed by a tearing sound like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart. The muzzle flash blinded the gunners for a moment, but when their vision cleared, they saw the result. The front row of the Japanese charge was gone. It wasn't that they had fallen down, it was that they had been swept away. The steel balls had caught them mid-stride and thrown them backward into the men behind them. But the Japanese did not stop. This was the terrifying nature of the Banzai charge. The men in the second row stepped over the bodies of the first row and kept running. They were driven by a code of Bushido that viewed retreat as a fate worse than death. So the gunners fired again and again. The barrel of the 37mm gun began to heat up. The loader worked in a frenzy, sliding the brass casings into the breech, slapping the recoil guard, and tapping the gunner on the shoulder to signal he was clear. Crack! Another 122 balls screamed across the sandbar. The sand itself was being churned up by the impacts, mixing with blood and water. The noise was deafening. The roar of the guns, the screams of the dying, the chatter of machine guns, and the constant roar of the ocean surf, creating a cacophony of hell. Colonel Ichiki watched from the tree line as his elite soldiers were fed into a meat grinder. He could not comprehend what was happening. He had expected the Americans to panic. He had expected them to break and run at the sight of a bayonet charge. Instead, he was watching his men vanish against an invisible wall. The canister shot was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was stripping the human element out of the war and replacing it with raw physics. Desperate, Ichiki ordered his mortar teams to fire. Grenades and mortar shells began to rain down on the Marine positions. Dust and smoke filled the air.
Some Japanese soldiers managed to crawl through the carnage and reach the barbed wire. They threw themselves onto the wire, using their bodies as bridges for their comrades. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in the foxholes. Marines fought with knives and rifle butts and helmets, but the 37mm guns kept firing. One Marine gunner later recalled that the barrel of his gun glowed cherry red in the darkness. He was terrified that the heat would cook off the next shell before he could close the breach. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. If the guns stopped, the Japanese would overrun them. The canister rounds were cutting swaths through the tall grass, chopping down vegetation as if a giant scythe were swinging across the riverbank. As dawn approached, the momentum of the Japanese attack finally broke. They had lost too many men. The survivors retreated into the coconut grove on the east bank, digging in and waiting for the end. But the Marines were not done. General Vandegrift, the division commander, decided to finish the battle decisively. He sent a battalion of Marines to flank the Japanese position upstream, crossing the river and circling behind them.
Then he unleashed the tanks. A platoon of M3 Stuart tanks rumbled across the sandbar, the same sandbar that was now carpeted with the bodies of the Japanese assault force. The tanks pushed into the coconut grove. The Japanese soldiers, trapped between the ocean and the advancing Marines, had nowhere to go. They tried to attack the tanks with magnetic mines and grenades, but the canister shot had decimated their numbers. The tanks acted as mobile shotguns. They fired canister rounds into the undergrowth, flushing out snipers and machine gun nests. They rolled over the shallow foxholes, crushing the defenders where they lay. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it was total. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. The aftermath was a scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The sandbar was unrecognizable. It was a carpet of mangled bodies. The heat of the tropical sun began to bake the battlefield, and the smell of death became overpowering within hours. The crocodiles from the river, which gave the creek its nickname Alligator Creek, began to crawl up the banks, drawn by the scent of blood. Colonel Ichiki, the proud samurai who had promised to take the airfield in one night, burned his regimental colors to prevent them from being captured. Then he walked into the jungle, sat down facing north toward the imperial palace, and committed ritual suicide. He could not live with the shame of what had happened. He had led 877 men into battle. Only a handful survived. The Marines had lost fewer than 40 men. The disparity in casualties was shocking. 800 dead versus 40. It was a ratio of 20-1. This wasn't just a victory. It was a message. The canister shot had proven that the Japanese spirit, no matter how fierce, could not overcome superior firepower. The Banzai charge, which had terrified the Chinese and the British, had been broken by a tin can filled with ball bearings. But the impact of the canister round went beyond the tactical victory. It changed the psychology of the American soldier. Before Guadalcanal, there was a fear that the Japanese were supermen, jungle ghosts who could not be killed. The canister shot proved that they were flesh and blood. It proved that they could be broken. However, there was a darker side to this victory. The carnage inflicted by the canister shot was so grotesque that it hardened the Marines. Seeing hundreds of men turned into hamburger meat desensitized them. It stripped away the last vestiges of the idea that war could be civilized. This was a war of extermination. The Japanese refusal to surrender, combined with the devastating lethality of American weaponry, set the tone for the rest of the Pacific campaign. It would be a war of no quarter. The M2 canister round continued to see service throughout the war. It was used in the jungles of New Guinea, where it cleared vegetation and enemy patrols with equal efficiency. It was used on the beaches of Saipan and in the caves of Okinawa. Tank crews loved it. They would often load a canister round as their first shot, knowing that in the split-second chaos of a jungle ambush, you didn't need to be accurate, you just needed to be fast and deadly.
Later in the war, the concept was scaled up. The Americans developed canister rounds for the larger 75mm guns on the Sherman tanks, and eventually for the 105mm howitzers. But it was the small 37mm round on that dark night in Guadalcanal that proved the concept. Today, if you visit the Tenaru River, it is a quiet place. The jungle has reclaimed the foxholes. The sandbar shifts with the tides, washing away the physical scars of the battle. But underneath the sand, if you dig deep enough, you can still find them. Small, rusted steel balls. They're the size of marbles. They look insignificant, but each one of them is a piece of history. They are the remnants of the night when physics met fanaticism. They are the legacy of a weapon that was never illegal, but felt like a war crime to those who witnessed its power. The Japanese army never fully recovered from the shock of the Tenaru. They learned a hard lesson that night. They learned that there is no glory in charging a machine gun. They learned that courage alone cannot stop a wall of steel. And for the young Marines like Thomas, who pulled the trigger that night, the memory of the canister shot never faded. They carried it home with them. They remembered the sound, the flash, and the silence that followed. The silence of 800 men erased from the earth. This was the reality of the canister shot, a weapon designed not just to kill, but to annihilate. And in the brutal calculus of the Second World War, it was the most effective tool the Allies possessed in the dark, terrifying jungles of the Pacific.